So maybe we need to start talking about sex in a more healthy way. Not pornography, but sex. Because sex is natural. Sex is something people actually...
It is natural, but so it's an impulse, and sex should be saved for one person in marriage.
But that's your own moral way of being. Not everyone feels that way.
It doesn't matter how they feel. It's the ideal. It's true.
But where does that come from? Where are your morals coming from?
The laws of nature, and nature is God. It's the ideal.
So who's God? Is that a Christian God? Is it a Jewish God?
I believe in the Christian God.
Okay, so that's in the moral space of Christianity.
Well, it's objectively true. I don't want to go too far in the spiritual domain.
And we pray that we'll be able to spread truth against the darkness at this moment in our history. We love you, Lord. Thank you. Amen.
Yeah, that's the point, Simone Biles. You're representing your nation, you're selfish sociopath. You kidding me? I just said she's probably the greatest gymnast of all time. She's also very selfish, she's immature, and she is a shame to the country. She's totally a sociopath. Of course she's a sociopath. Andrew says she's not a sociopath. What kind of person skips the gold medal match? Who does that? It's a shame to the nation.
The reason that I enjoy mocking someone like Charlie Kirk is because I actually share a lot of his flaws, and by projecting my flaws onto him and criticizing them, I have a better opportunity to address those flaws in myself. If you are someone like me who advocates for a specific set of political or moral prescriptions, then you immediately and inexorably find yourself in the ever-present danger of becoming too certain in those moral prescriptions. For example, I would agree with Charlie Kirk that most people who live in the United States are blessed to be here, in that it's the free country, it's wealthy, and most of the criticism, or not most, but much of the criticism that occurs in our current political discourse is driven often by resent, incompetence, and just mental illness in general. And when Charlie Kirk says something like the purpose of an American education is to inspire gratitude, there is a part of me that agrees with that to a significant degree.
Or eventually tell a true and patriotic story where you have people graduating that are thankful and have gratitude. That's the purpose of education when it comes through...
Gratitude is not the purpose of education.
Well, I think gratitude's a moral necessity.
But the problem is, even if what Kirk is saying is true, and even if he possessed a sophisticated and comprehensive philosophical justification for believing so, he and others like him, including myself, are permanently crippled by the limits of our own experience. What I mean is, Charlie Kirk, who grew up in the same wealthy suburbs of Chicago as I did, offers moral prescriptions that do not apply to many people in this country. For example, if you are a young kid living in an inner city in America, and your brother or father gets murdered by gangbangers, which happens far more often than privileged people such as myself ever have to think about. And then the elected officials that are supposed to advocate on behalf of that kid decide to defund the police and take away resources from addressing those crimes, thus leading to an increase in murder and an increase in the degradation of that kid's community. That's a situation that proves that the idea that everyone or most people should be grateful to live in America is insanity. It's backwards. And I think me, Charlie Kirk, and probably a number of people watching this video fall into this trap of misguided moral absolutism, in part because of our personalities and how we grew up. Jordan Peterson describes this issue quite well and also explains the most extreme consequences of having such a worldview.
So if you're smart, and there's going to be some of you people who are like that too, some of you, the primary trait that distinguished you from other people over the course of your whole life was that you were more intelligent than most, and you may have staked your identity on that and overvalue intelligence and rationality. And the problem with that is that you make a theory of the world and then you tend to assume that it's 100% correct. That's the tendency to fall in love with your own theories, and that's what a totalitarian does. The totalitarian says, here's the damn theory.
That is a gift we get to live in the United States of America, a gift from God.
And it's exactly right, and you're going to act it out exactly. And if you don't...
She's totally a sociopath. Of course she's a sociopath.
Well, we've got some special treats in mind for you.
At this point, we're living under corporate and medical fascism. When do we get to use the guns? I mean, literally, where's the line? How many elections are they going to steal before we kill these people?
So, no, no, hold on. No, stop, hold on. Now, I'm going to denounce that. I'm going to tell you why.
If you genuinely believe that Western society, for all its flaws, is a good thing that should be preserved, then you have a moral obligation to understand as best as you can the legitimate criticisms that people have of such a society. Only then can you be in a position to differentiate between the legitimate critiques and the critiques of a bunch of spiteful, incompetent, bitter, resentful children who live-action roleplay as revolutionaries or reactionaries. And if you can't differentiate and you lump everyone who disagrees with your particular moral philosophy as an enemy of the good, then inevitably you will get people asking these kinds of questions.
When do we get to use the guns?
Now, interestingly enough, Briahna Joy Gray, the former press secretary for Bernie Sanders, and therefore an apparent ideological opposite of someone like Charlie Kirk, also displays a level of misplaced moral assuredness that is worth examining.
And when I say that, I think that I would like for there to be no working class. I don't mean that there's no people working, but what aspirationally, we should be able to get to the point where we shift the kind of like the borderlines of what human beings are actually required to do, so that no one has to do the grunt work.
So to me, that view, and please forgive me for saying this, but it seems to me like it's very insulting, because the idea is that no one could possibly get dignity from a job like...
No, it's not about dignity. We should have dignity for people's work, no matter what they do, and we should demonstrate that by actually paying them living wages.
Now, I sympathize with Briahna Joy Gray because this is a perspective that I would have had previously and was based on essentially me projecting my perception and my experience of the world out onto everyone else and failing to recognize that my perception and experience of the world is filtered through a specific personality temperament, a specific level of openness to experience, which I'm sure Briahna Joy Gray shares and is sure many people watching share, but many people might not. And so conceptualizing political goals on an internal projection, an internal understanding doesn't work, as Batya Ungar-Sargon explains and pushes back.
Maybe it's my elitism that makes me feel like there's not a human being on the world that would prefer not to work with human feces for a living. But I think that it's fair to say that there's some things that people would prefer not to do.
And I think the idea that we want to get all those people out of those jobs and into college where they'll become like podcasters and philosophy professors, like there's something about that that's very insulting and very, to me, speaks to the real divide, which is that it's very hard for highly educated liberals to imagine that it's satisfying for somebody to be a janitor and that they would not have a complaint if they were paid a living wage.
So let me share with you one of the most useful pieces of psychological information that I've learned from, surprise, surprise, Jordan Peterson, and how it relates to what moral convictions people should stick to with some level of certainty.
Because, you know, relativists, modern relativists like to think of morality as something that's just arbitrary, like it's a cultural construction. You know, in society 1 thinks that A is bad and society 2 thinks that B is bad. And when you get right down to it, there's no commonality underneath all that. But the existentialists sort of undercut all that, and they just say, well, what's immoral are those things that you could change, that you do, that result in outcomes that are catastrophic for you. And so that's universal, because it doesn't really matter what the details are. You know, like what you do that's immoral could be very much different than what you do. It might be temperamental. You know, we're each in our own playing field in a sense. But there's a commonality underneath that, which is, well, for example, you won't get away with deceiving yourself. And the reason you can't is because you need a model of the world that's like the world. And if you try to live in a model of the world that isn't like the world, you'll just bump into the world. And so the deception brings with it its own punishment. And that's why it's immoral.
So putting this in practice, we can go back to Charlie Kirk's initial claim that sex should be reserved for one person in marriage.
And sex should be saved for one person in marriage.
But that's your own moral way of being. Not everyone feels that way.
It doesn't matter how they feel. It's the ideal. It's true.
I have friends who are very high in openness to experience, very creative type, open-minded type people who require a lot of sexual novelty in their relationship, to put it simply. To say that someone like that must be in a monogamous relationship at all times and never engage in any sexual activity outside of that relationship, even if it was agreed upon beforehand by the two people in that relationship, that's an example of someone projecting their own personality type onto others and making moral prescriptions as a result of that. The only moral conviction that I am absolutely certain of is that no matter what, you should not ever lie. If you require deception in any behavior, in any act, in any conversation, then you are engaging in something immoral. Because the moment you begin filling your head with lies, the moment you begin lying to yourself or to others, You create a model of the world that isn't accurate, that doesn't look like the world. And if you think that, for example, everyone who voted for Biden is a bad person, or everyone who voted for Trump is a bad person, and then you are going out in the world and you meet someone who voted for Biden and voted for Trump, well, now you either have to adjust and go, oh, wait a second, maybe I didn't actually mean that, or double down on your moral conviction and kind of be an asshole. And it's like, that's a very simplistic, sort of reductive example of that, but one that happens, I think, all the time. But it speaks to the broader issue of you should not lie, and that in and of itself is a faith claim. You kind of have to, there's no empirical or ultimate way to decide, well, is lying truly the most evil thing? It's like, you have to have faith and you have to put your flag down somewhere. And for me, for a variety of reasons, it's to try and never lie. And everyone fails and falls short, but I do think people pay for it in one way or another. And I've seen it with myself and with friends. But regardless, the point is, you can advocate for specific political and moral positions, but only if you have taken the time to understand the legitimate critiques against them, and you do not require any deception, any kind of lie to push those political and moral prescriptions. At least that is my perspective. So, good luck and Godspeed.